Guten Morgen. Bonjour. Hello. My name is Knut Detlefsen, and I represent the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation in Canada and the US. We are kind of the older sister of the Broadbent Institute. Obviously not me personally, but the foundation as a whole. And we are Germany's oldest political foundation, and we work internationally to hopefully promote social democracy, but also to create debate between progressives internationally and talk about important political questions. And building a good society, I think, is a very good team. And so I'm very pleased that we, together with the Broadbent Institute, were able to produce a report, Dreams and Realities on the Home Front, Canadians' Call for Government Action on Housing Affordability. And we partnered together on this project because we wanted to better understand why the housing affordability crisis has become so dominated Canadian politics. And I think in a time when populist parties on the right are appealing to younger voters who feel like they can't get ahead, it's very important, especially for those of us who believe that government can be a force for good in people's lives, to be very clear on how working people are experiencing this crisis and to understand their views on the best path out of it. And I want to thank our partners at Viewpoint Research for conducting the survey that underpins the report. They were really great to work with, and the insights from James Wolke and Natalia Piller were incredibly valuable. And despite the challenges that you will hear about in this report, I'm heartened by the clear call for action that we found. There is a future where all Canadians can have access to safe and affordable housing, and we hope this report and this discussion contributes to that work. So thank you very much for giving the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation the opportunity to be part of this summit and to be part of this conversation. But now I would like to hand it over to Clement Nokos, who will walk you through the findings of the report. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank, Knut. Good morning, liebe alles. It's not in German, don't worry. Good morning. Welcome to this presentation of this new report by the Broadbent Institute and the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung. And for those of you who don't know, I like to call FES the German grandfather of the Broadbent Institute due to the legacy of Ed Broadbent's work with German Chancellor Willy Brandt in the Socialist International, and that historic relationship that helped lead to the idea of building an organization like FES in Canada that became the Broadbent Institute. And so today's report, entitled Dreams and Realities on the Home Front, Canadians' Call for Government Action on Housing Affordability, which you can find for download on the Whova app, for those of you who've downloaded it, is a survey of people facing pressures of the housing affordability crisis in the two most expensive housing regions in the country, the GTHA and BC Lower Mainland, and how they perceive government's role in fixing this crisis. And to do this, we worked with Viewpoints Research, who was in the field in late February to collect this data. So I'd like to start off with why we're looking at the housing affordability crisis in this way. It comes from the narrative that former Conservative housing minister and leader of the opposition, Pierre Poilievre, says that governments should get out of the way of home building. Municipal gatekeeper governments are getting in the way of your affordability. We need to build homes, not bureaucracy. And there are a lot of slogans, how government is approaching housing, but what do people actually think about government's role in the housing crisis? And so, fortunately for Pierre, he's already got what he's wanted. The federal government has remained far removed from the business of building affordable housing for decades after the peak in post-war growth. The disappearance of public investment in affordable housing supply and the financialization of housing, where mortgages and homes are treated as assets for financial investments over decades, have become major contributing factors to the present crisis. And new public investment has only come as the median share of income used up on housing costs has skyrocketed over the last decade. Other polling over the past year also tells us it's a crisis. According to Leger, 95% of Canadians think increasing rental costs and the lack of affordable rental homes in Canada is a serious problem. 65% of Canadians think the federal government should be allocating more funding to its housing strategy. According to Abacus, when it comes to young people, 90% believe the government should prioritize ensuring housing is affordable. And so what we wanted to understand was what exactly are the current affordability pressures faced by ordinary Canadians? And how are people thinking about these pressures? And what are the government housing policies that, in their view, are needed to help them? So a clearer map here. This survey looks at the BC Lower Mainland. Some people might contest that some of these parts are not the Lower Mainland, and the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, but it also extends out to the Niagara region. But these are where housing prices have increased dramatically as the most expensive regions for housing in Canada, and where governments are looking back to get back into the business of building housing and acting on affordability. And so let's run through some of this data. Affordability is clearly a higher priority when it comes to the current housing situation for our respondents than anything else. Other concerns such as more space for your housing, the location of where you live, convenience of where your home is, those are also all issues somewhat related to affordability. We also find that home ownership is still aspirational. 81% of renters still hope to own their home someday, but the vast majority feel that this is unlikely in the next 5 years. You'll find in this report, too, that this pessimism is even starker among younger people. And when looking at how much of a priority housing affordability is among respondents, almost a quarter say that it is their top concern, and more than half say that it's at least among their top 5 concerns. But as was also hinted by those who feel the dream of homeownership is unobtainable, we can dig deeper to see how uneven these priorities are and how issues are distributed across the population. And so significantly, those aged 18 to 29 years old are more likely to see housing affordability a top 5 concern compared to older generations, and it's also more likely a concern for those whose household incomes are under $100,000 annually and for renters. And lastly, if you have a mortgage, it's likely that housing affordability is one of your top concerns. And so with that look at the unevenness of perceived concern, we also look at the uneven experiences regarding housing affordability. Survey respondents were mostly concerned about increases in rent or mortgage costs and loss of their job or income when it comes to potential loss of their home, highlighting how affordability is actually central to housing precarity. And it's not just some far-off worry, it's precarity today. When asked if housing costs were to increase by 10% in the next year, more than a third of respondents said that they could not afford their current housing situation, and a substantial 17% were just unsure. This is a major concern among the younger generation, 19 to 29 years old, where more than half say they can't afford that much of an increase, and 21% are unsure whether they could afford it either. This is also reflected among lower-income households and half of renters in particular, while a quarter of homeowners still also say that they can't afford an increase. This fear also comes from how costs already eat into household budgets. According to the CMHC, as a general rule, your monthly housing costs should be no more than 32% of your average gross before tax monthly income to be considered within your means. And we find that way over half of respondents in the GTHA and the BC Lower Mainland use up more than 30% of their household incomes on housing costs, with 17% using up more than half of their income. Breaking this down, more than half of the younger generation are spending more than can be deemed affordable, and a significant 20% just don't know what proportion of their household income is being spent on housing. Kind of scary. The same is true for lower income folks, and more than a quarter spending over half of their household income on housing. Notably, a quarter of renters and a quarter of mortgage holders are also spending more than half of their household income on housing costs. This demonstrates that concern for housing affordability is not only a feeling, but a reality, as the current housing situation puts enormous economic strain on Canadians who rent, who are low income, or were born after 1994. So with the crisis perceived and certainly felt, we looked at who's to blame for the housing crisis, and also contrary to a lot of the scapegoats that other narratives are looking to blame, ordinary Canadians quite clearly see financial actors as responsible for the crisis. Perceptions of foreign investors top the list, followed by the federal government, as well as real estate developers, corporate landlords, and the provincial government. These findings suggest that Canadians understand that the financialization of housing is a significant factor behind the rising housing costs. It's also notable, given the federal government's top placement in blame, while having a greatly diminished role in housing in recent decades. Though they've also taken up a lot of space in recent housing discourse, respondents don't feel like NIMBYs, municipal governments, or immigrants and international students are really at fault for the crisis. And so while certain federal politicians espouse the idea that municipalities are being gatekeepers to getting housing built, substantially more blame the federal government and the provincial government for the housing crisis. This is also despite the federal government staying largely out of the way of housing over several decades, suggesting that this is more about needing government to get back into housing. And breaking this down between the different administrative contexts of BC and Ontario, we have some interesting insights. In the BC Lower Mainland, significantly fewer respondents blame the provincial government compared to the federal government, a finding that could be attributed to a flurry of recent housing policy announcements by the government of BC meant to relieve affordability pressures through a combination of reforms and investments aimed at increasing housing supply at the time of the survey. The government of Ontario, on the other hand, has more recently been mired in scandal regarding policies that favor real estate developers in the environmentally protected Greenbelt. Given these developments at the time of the survey, respondents have assigned a higher proportion of blame for unaffordability to the provincial government in Ontario, sharing that blame with the federal government. And now for what I think was really the key question of this research project. Do Canadians want the federal government to get back into the business of building affordable housing? The answer is unsurprisingly yes. Overall, a strong majority of respondents from both the Lower Mainland and the GTHA want to see the federal government get back into housing building, with 41% wanting the government back into building more non-market housing, and 39% looking for a mixed approach to let developers build while getting the federal government into the business of building non-market housing. And then breaking this down further, an overwhelming 53% of young people think the federal government would get back into the business of building more affordable housing to improve their housing situation. The same overwhelming desire comes from those of lower income households and renters as well. And significantly, even among those higher income households who likely own their home, are likely older, more than half support the federal government intervention in affordable housing, alongside letting developers build more market housing. But the message is clear. Government in housing is clearly not the problem, but in fact, most Canadians need the federal government to get back into the business of home building. There's more in the report, so I invite you to download it off of Whova, but thank you very much for this presentation. And now to discuss how to get government back into the business of building affordable housing are a couple of government representatives. Joining us for this fireside chat, we have on stage again, Mayor Olivia Chow, Mayor of Toronto, who's bringing forward a bold action plan on housing affordability at the municipal level. We also have Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing, Peter Fragiskatos, to bring the federal government's perspective on affordability. And to guide us through this conversation, we have Professor Caroly Whitzman of the University of British Columbia's Housing Assessment Resource Tools projects with us today. Please welcome them to the Progress Summit stage.
I certainly hope introductions have taken place of these two very eminent folks. I'm going to launch right into it because I bet you all have a lot of questions. And the way that we're going to start it is that Mr. Fragiskatos, close enough?
Very close. You're almost Greek with that. Fragiskatos, that's fine.
Fragiskatos and Madame Mayor Chow will each speak for a few minutes about their opinions on the government's role in housing, and then we'll launch into some questions, and hopefully we'll have time for some questions from the floor, because I know it's an issue that excites many of you. I can see some of you in the audience. All right, we didn't rock, paper, scissors this, so let's start off with you, Mr. Fragiskatos.
I appreciate it. I can sit here and keep it informal. What do you prefer?
I like fireside chat, so why don't you just stay here? It'll save us some time in getting up and down from the mic.
We can do that. We'll keep it informal. First of all, apologies in advance. You're going to see me using my cell phone. The reason I'm using my cell phone is not to be rude by any means. We have the Conservatives trying to block passage of key legislation on the transition towards a green economy and green jobs, and they've presented a mountain of amendments that are intended to delay the passage of that bill. So we are voting today in the House of Commons. We have an app on our phones, so if you see me looking into my phone really weirdly, you know the reasons. It's for a good reason, but trust me, I'd much rather be here unobstructed with all of you. Thank you very much for the invitation. This is a really wonderful opportunity to engage with all of you. Thank you especially to the Broadbent Institute for the work that they do, keeping up and holding up high the legacy of Ed Broadbent, who made Canada a better place. Canada is better because of people like Ed Broadbent. We are less without him. I say that as a liberal, but this was someone that truly made an enormous difference in the everyday lives of Canadians. And his focus was on a range of things, but housing was always front and center. And here we are. We have a housing crisis, something that needs to be addressed head on, and I think we have to address it recognizing the complexity of the moment, recognizing that it's not just one thing, recognizing that there are so many different aspects to the housing crisis in front of us. First of all, we have to build more. We have to add to supply. If we add to supply, it's going to be easier for people to purchase a home, and it's going to be easier for people to rent a home if that's what they ultimately want to do. The way that is going to happen is we have to make the math work, and we have to provide those incentives and encourage along municipalities and provinces, and thankfully we have a mayor like Mayor Chow. I'm from London, Ontario, and I'm an MP there. Mayor Morgan, other mayors across the country that have wanted to genuinely work with us. I'm not going to take up a whole lot of time with the answer, but the Housing Accelerator Fund is something that I would point to as one of the signature policies of the government, working with municipalities, working with mayors and councils to see zoning changes take place that would allow for, among other things, missing middle housing to be front and center. Duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, mid-rise apartments, row houses, all of that has a place in Canada, or ought to have a place. Unfortunately, for too often, those have been illegal. I think that is the word to use here. Minister Fraser has used it as well. We need to think outside the box, and missing middle housing provides a real way forward. At the federal level as well, we are providing low-interest loans to help create more rental supply. Condos have been really the option for many people, but they're just much more expensive. And so to increase the rental supply, there are low-interest loans available through the Apartment Construction Loan Program. And we've also, just a few months ago, you would have seen given a waiver on GST. GST as applied to construction costs for purpose-built rentals. And that is going to, oh, thanks for that. No, a GST waiver would lead to that kind of applause. I'll take it, though. Finally, it's so important that in the context of this discussion, we continue to focus on making sure that everyday everyday people and fellow citizens who don't have a roof over their head are given the non-market options that are so critical. In Canada, we have to do much better on this. When 4% of the housing stock is made up of non-market housing, that's not acceptable. We have to increase that. And I think this is going to be discussed, but it's up to government to do that. We're going to rely on the private sector and working with municipalities, providing incentives, encouraging along, as I said, changes that lead to it being easier to buy a home and to rent a home. But when it comes to the non-market options, whether it's rent geared to income or supportive housing, community-based housing, all the different ways that co-op housing, of course, all these different ways to carry out non-market housing, I think that government has an enormous role to play in that regard. So this is what we're seized with at the federal level. There's more announcements coming. You would have seen a suite in the past few days of announcements, but Minister Fraser is making an announcement today, a very important one, unveiling as we speak, in fact, unveiling the full housing policy. So thank you very much, Carol, for that introduction, and back to you.
Thank you, Peter. I hope I can call you Peter and you, Olivia, for the duration of this panel. It'll keep things informal. Having said that, Olivia wants to speak at the podium because she has notes and did her homework.
Short person, one needs to.
That too.
Yeah. Hi there. Good morning. Here I'm back again. We do know there's a, yeah, oh, thank you. We are in the midst of a housing crisis, and you can see it, and as 1 out of 10 people in Toronto use the food bank. Why are they at the food bank? Because the rent is too high, and no matter how many jobs you have, for some people, you just can't pay rent and still have enough food left. Whether it's kids or seniors, I know of a 60-year-old former construction worker, worked all his life, lost his job because of back injury, and he's one of the 90,000 people on the City of Toronto wait list for affordable housing. And because it costs him a lot more than $1,000 a month to pay rent, and that eats up his entire monthly disability check, the ODSP check, which there's nothing left. So he goes to the daily, the food bank for food and all that stuff, and because of all that stress, his heart is giving him trouble. In some ways, I picked up the Jack Layton book on homelessness. This was written, and this copy is getting very yellow because it's old. And in one of it is, say, the way forward, and it talks, the recommendations in here, ironically, is still very applicable for today. And so you and I know the impact of not building affordable housing and not building housing for 3 decades. 3 decades, that's how long it is. The impact it has on human lives, and is severe. But I'm not here to depress you. I'm here to say that after a long time away, Toronto is back building housing. Yep, we are. And so when I first got elected, the first thing I said, I need a blueprint to build 65,000 units of rental buildings, rental units, okay. Oh, usually it takes 6 months or a year to get a blueprint. No, I need it in 2 months. And the staff go, oh. I helped in helping to put the blueprint together, but in November, we put out a blueprint, and what did we do? First thing, we redefine the definition of affordability. Affordability has been 80% of market. It's market-driven. 80% of market in Toronto, that's not affordable, It's still $2,000 for maybe a bedroom, right? It's not affordable. So we are saying instead of it market-driven, be people-driven, we're saying that it needs to be a third of the income of the person. That's our definition of affordability. The second thing we did was to say, okay, let's look at all the city lands. Parking lots. Yeah, we can build housing on parking lots. We have a lot of city lands, so we identified a lot of them. We keep identifying them now, right? Whether it's community centers, libraries, you can build on top of it. There's many empty vacant land or land that is not necessarily vacant, but we certainly have higher density. And then we partner with nonprofit organizations and other organizations with 280 of them. And we've put in $180.8 million to start building housing. That's the second thing. And the third thing we did was we are pushing for inclusionary zoning so that if you want to come in and have higher density along transit corridors, sure. But we want a good percentage of it being affordable. So we are negotiating with the provincial government to say, come on, you can do this. We're negotiating with some of the developers because if they want higher density, come on, you can do a lot more than what you're doing now. We put in some money, $600 million to the Housing Secretariat so they could build. And we are the largest landlord with 80,000 units already, subsidized units through the Toronto Community Housing Company Corporation. Those are rent geared to income. And we put in $200 million to fix what we have because a lot of them are falling apart. Third thing we did, that's three. And then the fourth thing is that we have an open door policy. If you're building affordable housing, we exempt your property tax, your development charges, your park levy, your and so that you could get more funds to build, you save some money to build affordable housing. That's the fourth thing. And the fifth thing is we're partnering with the federal government. I think today there might be an announcement. There's a program called Rapid Housing Initiative. It's really wonderful because what it is supportive housing. It's a wraparound service because some people, if you just give them a unit, is not good enough. You need to have supportive service. It could be they might be disabled, or they might need some mental health support, they need some group work, they need some support, right? So that's called supportive housing. Right now in Toronto, we have 26,000 people on the wait list for supportive housing. And you folks did 3 rounds, and I think it might be after today, 4th round coming. So we're building those supportive housing, which is very, very important. Number 6, we started a program called multi-residential acquisition funds. What's that? That's when a group of tenants are facing evictions because the landlord wants to renovate or demolish the building. Usually the tenants have been living there for 30, 40 years. It is affordable. Why? Because it's built here in Ontario. It's built before 2018. So a lot of the older buildings, we're losing about 14 times faster than we can, in terms of affordable housing, faster than we can build them. So we need to save these buildings. So these acquisition funds provide a grant or a loan to the tenants when they form a land trust or a cooperative, so they could, with an organization, with a community organization, nonprofit, so that we take it from the private market and make it public so that the tenants can stay there forever in the most affordable way. So Toronto have this program for now, and the BC has a program, and in the Toronto program is $100 million. It went from 10 million, I added 90 million, so 100 million. And the federal government, 1 week ago, announced a national acquisition fund. and I believe it is $2 billion. It's $1.5 billion of grant, of loan, and $500 million of grant. So a little program from the City of Toronto is now national, so this is worthy of celebration. I know I'm going over, but I thought if you ask me a question of what we're doing, it's a long list. Okay, 2 more. While we're building, right, it takes a while to build. So we're saving existing buildings, renovating them, turning it into co-ops and a land trust. We are now, and with the partners from the federal and the provincial government, we now have rent supplements through a program called Canada-Ontario Housing Benefits. And it's great because it's a rent supplement. So if you only have $600 for rent, if you need another $200 in order to get something, or $300, we will supplement that money so that you would be able to immediately find a permanent home. And that program have created affordable housing for over 3,000 plus people through the rent supplement program. The Canada benefit, and I hope it gets renewed, and I think it will, hopefully. I don't know, but that's one thing that is an ongoing program. Hopefully there will be a renewal. The last one, what the city have done is, of course, we put in 1,300 new rent geared to income unit, but we have also, the last one, number 8, I like the number 8, very Chinese thing. The last one is something called, we put in money because people are facing evictions. We have put in $2 million for rent banks, rent save, to provide support for tenants so that when they are facing big problems, we can, because sometimes you get laid off, you just need a little bit of money to get you over the hump. We have a rent bank. We also have people to inspect the building so that if the elevator has been broken for many weeks, or hot water is not working, or if there's cockroaches all over the place, we are inspecting more so that tenants will have better rights. So those are some of the things we are doing. There's a lot more work we can do, and we'll explore together how we could work together and really build affordable housing. Thank you.
Okay, we've had some great opening statements, and of course, so much has been going on over the last few weeks, the last few months. I want to get up in the helicopter, and I want to start with the federal level of government. Believe me, I'll get to the municipal level of government in a moment.
They have more money.
We'll get to that.
True.
Okay. 10 years ago, I was in Australia. I was really excited to see news from Canada that wasn't about moose or bears. It was the announcement after Prime Minister Trudeau was elected of a $120 billion plan that would integrate affordable housing, sustainable transport, energy efficiency. It looked so great. That's when I started thinking about moving back to Canada. And then in 2019, we had the National Housing Strategy announced with targets of 530,000 households lifted out of core housing need, living in unaffordable, overcrowded, poorly repaired and/or poorly repaired homes. That was half of the tenants who are in core housing need, according to the census. And also a goal to have chronic homelessness, which later the Prime Minister changed to eliminating chronic homelessness. And all of those really ambitious, costed out goals. Now the National Housing Strategy is sitting at around $89 billion. We're 6 years into a 10-year strategy. Peter, how are we doing at meeting those targets? Oh, you're voting. Okay. Oh, great, I get a longer preamble. How are we doing at creating those green jobs? Well, yay.
Democracy in 2024.
And isn't it wonderful how we can work from stage now? Never mind working from home, we can work from stage.
There we go. Sorry about that.
Okay, sorry.
Blame Poilievre, not me.
Absolutely. So, 6 years in, are we meeting those targets? Were they the right targets?
There's a few things there. Let me just cut right to it, though. Anytime you have people living on the street, and in my community and communities across the country, this is not acceptable. So I think that we have to do more. Of course we must do more, and we must work with the not-for-profit organizations, the outstanding organizations on the ground. I'm not sure if there's representation in the room today from not-for-profits, but they have the expertise to provide, among other things, the supportive housing that Mayor Chow talked about, that I alluded to in my remarks. When you have wraparound supports, someone has a chance. Fellow citizens who have found themselves in a very difficult situation have a chance to transition to something better. Mental health supports on site, a nurse to help with physical health care on site, 3 square meals a day, job training even. This is a model of housing that I think is instrumental. Just yesterday there was a wonderful report on the CBC from my community in London talking about in just a few months how members of the community had been who were homeless are now living in a supportive housing situation. It's making a tremendous difference. The National Housing Strategy does place a focus on supportive housing. We want to do more, of course. We must do more. There are encampments, and there's going to be an announcement later today on how we can better tackle the issue of encampments. But you asked me, has the national, I don't think, Carol, you put it exactly in these terms, but the question is there, has the National Housing Strategy been enough? Has it achieved its goals? Well, we obviously have a situation of homelessness that persists. So no, it's incomplete. But we have seen 70,000 citizens lifted off the street. We have seen 125,000 people who were very close to being homeless as a result of rental supplements provided through the federal government. They are not on the street. They're in a much better position than they were, in fact, prior. So we build off of these things. Mr. Poilievre has presented a private member's bill, so-called, on housing. He doesn't talk about affordable housing at all. He doesn't talk about supportive housing once. So I think that sloganeering is one way to go, right-wing populism is one way to go, but in that context, the vulnerable will not benefit. I think that the way forward is to work with municipalities, to work with willing provinces, to build more homes, and at the same time place a focus on supportive housing in particular, but non-market options in general that will make life more affordable for people.
Thank you, Peter. And Olivia, we're about halfway through, a little over halfway through a 10-year strategy, a national strategy. What's the one thing, and there is going to be an announcement today from Minister Fraser, what's the one thing that you feel the national housing strategy needs to have learned from the first 6 years?
That supply itself, it's not enough. And to build affordable housing, you have to be intentional, and it would cost money. But in the long run, it saved the government a lot of money on health care, on any number of social determinants, because if you don't have good housing, your health deteriorates, mental health deteriorates. If you live on the street, you have half the lifespan of ordinary Canadians, right? So people die faster, kids are malnourished because they don't have enough money for food, all of that. So you can't just build housing alone, that you have to invest, and it cannot be, it costs money. At the end of the day, it's 100,000, 200,000 is not enough. It's double that at least. And but in the long run, we save money, but we need to invest now.
Okay, my next question, I'm going to warn you in
Just
advance. Oh, wait, before I ask the
yeah.
next question.
There is a blueprint. So the Rapid Housing Initiative that was introduced then worked. Except that is, at that time, was the smallest program, even though it's the most popular program. It's the most effective but the smallest. So I wish 7 years ago, you could look back, I wish that was the biggest program because it was the most popular and the most effective program.
And, sorry, wonk alert, the Rapid Housing Initiative wasn't even part of the National Housing Strategy to begin with. It was one of the measures that was brought in by during COVID. And actually, let's just toss the questions out the window. Peter, the great thing about the Rapid Housing, there's two great things about the Rapid Housing Initiative. First of all, it's the only program that's really dealt with the people who are most in need. The second advantage of the Rapid Housing Initiative is that it showed off how much modular housing could make a difference. It's actually been a huge boost to the productivity issue around building housing. The big problem with the Rapid Housing Initiative is that it's upfront grants, which is fantastic in terms of getting housing built quickly. But there is reluctance, perhaps from finance, from Treasury Board, in that level of upfront grants. Plus, it does take operating funding from the province for health and social services. I'm sorry, as I say, I'm kind of jumping the questions out the windows.
That's fine. It's
Tell me about, from your perspective, why it's been so difficult to make Rapid Housing Initiative an ongoing program like the apartment loans, et cetera.
Well, it's gone through 3 rounds. We've seen 15,000 people housed as a result of it. The capital expenditures are there through the federal government. We talk about homelessness. You have to have a focus on capital and you have to focus on operating. And we need provinces to step up as well. We have municipalities that want to be on side. We have not-for-profit organizations. I talked about them before. I can't talk about them enough in terms of what they contribute. The federal government is there to do what is expected of it in terms of providing the capital expenditure rather. But the provinces need to, whether it's through initiatives meant to house people as quickly as possible, but the broader vision on supportive housing, the operating expenses, we need provinces to step up. Premier Eby in British Columbia is doing some wonderful things. Frankly, I think premiers could learn from Premier Eby to be, there you go, to be frank about it on a range of things. We all have a responsibility. Yes, it's a federation. That requires, we have to recognize the complexity that comes along with that. But in the end, we have to live up to the responsibilities of the moment.
Thank you. One of the basic issues, and it's come up several times already, is that we need municipalities, provinces and territories, federal government to be singing from the same song sheet. And that kind of starts with a consistent definition of affordability. And as you've already mentioned, Olivia, sort of some folks use market rate housing. The CMHC has used at least 3 different definitions of affordability in its 3 major programs. There's also the issue that in 2019, Canada passed something called the National Housing Strategy Act, and that committed us to adequate housing, which includes things that we don't even count anymore in housing need, like accessibility, like the right location, like tenure security, the protection against getting evicted. So I'm going to start with you, Olivia. What's the working definition? What's the most important thing as you think about affordable and adequate housing in terms of just defining what it is, let alone building it?
It's not rocket science. We used to define it from the 70s, 80s to 90s, mid-90s, as income-based. It's a person's income. As they earn more money, then the subsidy is lessened. And people just sometimes need a bit of support for a period of time. If you look at cooperatives, it's that security. It's mixed income building, which is the best model to go. And the definition really is the person, if you are earning a smaller amount because you're disabled, for example, or you just got laid off for a couple of months, then your income really should be the definition. So it needs to be an income-based definition, and there needs to be, at the end of the day, that there's enough money left for you to live and be able to eat and not go to the food bank. So it's the third for us, it's for the City of Toronto. We've always defined, that's not true. In the last 10 years, it got changed into a market, 80% market. But now I've changed it back. So it's now a third of the income, which is the rent geared to income waiting list that we have, where we have 90,000 households waiting for affordable housing. So in my mind, the definition is income-based, a third of your income.
Thank you, Olivia. And Peter, another thing that happened from the 40s to the 80s when the federal government was taking the lead on housing policy is that it had income categories, and it focused on the needs of particularly low-income people, but also moderate-income households. So in Canada now, a low-income household, a household that's reliant on minimum wage, Social Security or social assistance is a whole other issue, can afford a maximum of $1,000 a month rent. How much can and should the federal government take leadership in having consistent definitions, using income categories again in its work with provinces, territories, municipalities, given that it's quite happy, and I'm quite happy for them, to bully municipalities, or I should say to offer incentives for municipalities to do certain things, provinces to do certain things?
Well, I'll say this, that, and I agree that only focusing on supply is not the answer, but if we don't keep supply in mind, we're not going to get to the outcomes that we want. The crisis in rent, the crisis in home ownership is really a reflection of a lack of supply. We need to build more. We have to, especially in the context of high interest rates and other challenges that builders are facing with high costs in terms of building materials. There's a range of other challenges as well. Building more is absolutely fundamental. I talked about some of the incentives that the federal government has put on the table before. There will be further incentives announced today as well that will add to that. But so that will bring down, whether it's the cost of rent, whether it's the cost of home ownership. But this is not where it ends. I think there is room for the federal government to think more about rent. There is the Renters' Bill of Rights that's recently been announced. That is not set in stone. There could be more added to it. We did, as a condition of infrastructure funding, recently make clear that if provinces want access to the $5 billion in infrastructure funding that's so necessary for housing, water, wastewater, stormwater infrastructure, solid waste infrastructure, that they do have to sign on to the Renters' Bill of Rights. And we continue to engage with all stakeholders to understand what a Renters' Bill of Rights could look like. There are some basics there already in terms of understanding a renter should know the history of the price of a unit that they're interested in. They should know, they should be able to, if there's an issue with rent eviction, a standardized lease could provide a way forward. If there is an issue at the landlord-tenant board that they need financial assistance with, that's part of it as well. But it is, as I say, not set in stone. So where I'm going with it is, I think there's more to think about with respect to making rent more affordable that requires not a market option, but a government, the government to take concrete action. And that requires, yes, the federal government, but provinces too. This is still their main area of jurisdiction. Some are living up to the needs of the moment, others are not.
Thank you. I want to continue talking a little bit about supply. It's very much the discussion of the moment. So Scotiabank last year recommended that the Canada double the amount of non-market housing. And the Royal Bank recently came out with a report saying perhaps tripling or even a greater proportion of non-market housing should be considered. I'm going to start with you, Olivia, because I think there's a
vote
going on, absolutely. So I know that Toronto's been modifying its targets, as you
Yep.
mentioned. What do you think should be the targets for instance, non-market housing, and how, more importantly, do you think that all levels of government can work to scale up non-market housing?
It's interesting. Folks probably have heard of Mark Carney and Lisa Raitt, not flaming socialist. They had a task force report that released last month, among others, that said that, yes, CMHC said that it needs 5.8 million new homes by 2030, and that 2.3 million of these homes needs to be non-market and below market housing. That's 40%, 4 out of 10. Isn't that a good target to have? 40% non-market, right? We have committed approximately $8 billion in land, capital and operating funding, waive fees and charges, what you just heard I said earlier. We are looking at federal government can help provide funding for housing, grants, low-cost financing, which we saw coming through, a program called Canada Built that was announced, $15 billion a few days ago. Affordable loans, okay, so that's what the feds can do. We would like to access Canada lands because I know Department of Defense have lots of lands, and the provincial government have lands. Hey, let's pull our lands together. We've asked the school board to provide lands also. Let's just pull all the lands together and we'll build non-market housing. So number two. Number three, we need a lot of skills trades to ramp up the construction. So train, right? Yeah. So that's number three. Number four, really have, as you talked about, real rent control. Right now, the rent control is only for buildings that are after 2018. This is in in Ontario. So I know it's not good, it needs to change, right? But I'm not the premier. So we need,
Yes.
we need real rent control to protect tenants so that they don't get rental evicted and demo evicted.
Thank you. Peter, I'm going to add a couple of other non-radical names to Lisa Raitt, Scotiabank, RBC. Way back in 1944, an economist from Queen's University named Curtis said that in order to build back better after World War II, Canada needed a third non-market housing, a third rent, but regulated, and in fact, he talked about co-ops in that context, and a third market ownership. One of the sponsors of this conference is a German group, and there's been a counselor from Hamburg. Hamburg has targets, and which it's successfully met for 10 years, of a third non-market construction, a third rental with rent control, and a third market ownership. Do you see that your government considering these kinds of targets and the mechanisms that would help achieve those targets?
We want to help. We want to help see more non-market housing built in Canada. 4% is not nearly enough. We have to do much more. I talked about the benefits of non-market housing earlier. Mayor Chow has done the same. We all recognize that. I know I'm speaking to a room that is very sympathetic to that. There's many ways to get there, as I talked about before. One thing, and Mayor Chow mentioned it, and thank you to the work that's been done for her in Toronto, the acquisition fund there, Premier Eby's work in BC. We can learn from these experiences in terms of what's now called the Canada Rent Protection Fund. This is the acquisition fund that many in the room, I think, have advocated for. This is something, and kudos to my former colleague, Daniel Blakey, who was really instrumental in making that happen, I have to say. It's unfortunate that he's decided to leave federal politics, but I know he's going to do great things in Manitoba. This is something that I think will really move the needle in a positive way when you have $1.5 billion on the table that can go to not-for-profits. That can purchase properties and keep rents affordable. One of the issues, one of the challenges that will come up in that is capacity. You and I were in Fredericton the other day, Carol, for a conference where not-for-profits were in the room, and that is one of the challenges that was identified. But I think we can, I mean, if that is in some ways a good problem to have, if you have so many not-for-profits putting up their hand wanting to help. So I think that, yes, we have to see more non-market options. The mayor has talked about land. Yes, there is federal land available, there's municipal land available, there's provincial land available, either not used at all, or if it's underused, I think it has to be looked at as well. What could be more useful from a federal perspective is leasing instead of selling land, because if you sell it, you don't know what exactly what it could be used for. But if you are still able to, leasing provides the option of ensuring that it remains affordable. So these are things that I think you'll see the federal government talking more on and acting more on.
That's great. I love big sites, I'm not going to lie. I really want us to be ambitious again, as we were in the era of St. Lawrence neighborhood and Falls Creek South, et cetera. But that brings us to questions of finance and questions of taxes. And also, I feel I haven't picked on the municipal level enough yet, so I'm going to turn there. Housing, critical social infrastructure, municipalities pay 60% of infrastructure costs with 10% of tax revenue. And one of the really insidious, at least to me, I am now opining, aspects of that gap has been the notion that growth should pay for growth, bigger and bigger development charges, which has undoubtedly had a big impact on supply in Toronto and in other large cities. So given those constraints, Olivia, what is a solution in terms of who should pay and how we can turn things from quite regressive taxes, like property taxes right now are as regressive. Renters pay more than indirectly than homeowners. Development charges are regressive. They charge newcomers for community benefits, including affordable housing that will help everyone. How do we move away from that dependence on regressive taxes towards more progressive sources of funding? And all of the answers don't need to be within municipalities by any means.
Do you have an hour?
No, we have 10 minutes.
Okay. You probably have heard me in the last, 30 years. It's actually only 9%. So of the $100, so 9 cents per dollar of all the taxes you pay. April is coming, income tax time. We don't get any of it. There's just the property tax, which is only 9 cents per each dollar that you pay, which then brings the problem. You're absolutely correct. As the city gets less funding, they look for funding from other places, development charges, Section 37, Section 43, et cetera, lot levies, you name it. It just piles on, then it makes the unit more expensive. So how do we get around with it? Well, if the federal government likes to give us allow us to charge income tax, we could welcome that, because that's a progressive way of taxing. So Taylor Swift is coming to town to Toronto, and yes, and she will generate a lot of economic benefits. HST, hotel rooms, eating, drinking, all types of things. The City of Toronto gets none of it because we don't get any of the sales tax. So any of the HST, if you want to provide 1 cent of the HST to the City of Toronto, we'll be very happy about that too, so that we don't have to worry about finding the funds from development charges, etc. Or outright grant. So in this round, I noticed there is an infrastructure fund that came from the feds, which is great. They have 2 programs. One is the gas tax, which is the Canada Community Building Fund. The second one is a possibility of a national infrastructure fund, which every government have had, even, whether it's Paul Martin or Stephen Harper, have had, remember those big checks? Those big checks with arrows in it, right? Stimulus checks, yeah. So we don't mind receiving big checks as long as we get them. So infrastructure fund would be great. So whether we will see a big infrastructure program on next Tuesday, I don't know. So it could be grant, it could be vacating tax room. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, we need support in building roads and sewage and water and school, libraries, parks and roads, all those things that make a community complete.
Peter, 30 seconds, taxes?
Well, I will take the mayor's point back about income taxes and municipalities. No, look, I don't think we're going to settle the nuances of tax policy here, Carol, but I think that what I hear from the mayor is someone who wants to continue to be a willing partner. We've provided hundreds of millions of dollars to the City of Toronto for a range of needs, particularly on housing, and we want to continue to partner with municipalities. Yes, I understand the limitations of property taxes for mayors. I've not served on municipal council, but I have many friends who have and who do. This is difficult, and when we work together, though, we can tackle these needs that are facing us, that are a challenge, and we can and should do much better. So we'll watch for the budget, and we'll keep working with cities to see more building across the country.
Thank you. I do have one last question, and I'm not sure we're going to have time for questions, but I'll hope we do, because I do want to end up talking about this generational issue that, at a certain point in my life, we were able to buy a house, and it seems less and less certain that people under 35 and 40 will. But there are countries, Switzerland, Germany, Austria, Denmark, several other countries, where it's majority renter, and yet they're able to save for retirement, they're able to live securely in their homes. Oh, I see another vote coming up. That's no problem. So what do we need to do? And maybe, again, I'll start with Olivia. What do we need to do so that renters have equal right to secure long-term accommodation, and that they're not driven into home ownership out of desperation?
Mm-hmm. I talked a bit about, and I was talking about the rent banks, the rent safe, all of that. I don't need to repeat that. We're very glad to see the federal government for working to support renters and provide better protections against evictions. The announcement, we'll see the details of it probably on Tuesday. We've asked the province to put in real rent control many times. We're still waiting for them to do that. We have an eviction prevention program. We call it EPIC, because sometimes some folks would have some issues, sometimes, and then they get evicted because maybe it's not as clean as it should be. So we actually have social workers coming in to help over the period. I'll give my dad as an example when he was alive. He loved feeding pigeon because he had a biology degree. He lives in an apartment, so he has a what do you call it? A balcony. So he loves to have the pigeon come to his balcony and he feeds them. So imagine if you live downstairs, the pigeon shit, that is like, ouch. And I had to intervene or else he would have been evicted. So examples like that, having people that support the community, in this community support, so that people don't get evicted, is really it's a community development, community support program that is really important. So there are many other potential ways that we could have bylaws to support tenants, but ultimately the tenants issue is very provincial. We don't have complete control over it.
And of course, the level of government that's missing from this panel today is provincial, and I'm certainly not going to take on that role. And Peter, I really appreciate, I know that you've had to be multitasking, and you've been doing a really excellent job. There have been times when the federal government has stepped in the 40s. It instituted rent freezes in order to protect key workers during the war. In the 1970s, Trudeau Sr. said to the provinces and municipalities, you need to step in, inflation's gone bananas. And all of the provinces and territories brought in rent controls. What should the federal government do to give tenants equal rights to owners?
Well, look, every level of government has obviously its jurisdiction to look after. However, it's unacceptable. There's one citizen, there's one taxpayer to use that. So it's unacceptable that fellow citizens would be evicted when, in the context of rent evictions and what is taking place. Hence, you have the government looking at things like a standardized lease agreement, putting that on the table, a fund that renters can look at to deal with challenges that come up, landlord-tenant issues that they might need financial assistance with. These kinds of issues are where we can help, but yes, we won't be able to do that on our own. It's up to the provinces to really act, and I left open before the possibility of what we could see with the Renters' Bill of Rights. So you have a government that is very live to the challenges that renters are facing. I talked before about how ultimately we want to see more buildings so the cost of rent comes down. When the cost of rent comes down, people will have obviously more funds that they can put towards saving for a down payment for a home, if that's what they wish. If they want to continue renting, that's more than okay too. Ultimately, thousands of Canadians rent. That's obvious, and we have to recognize the context, and the context is that it's very difficult to rent right now. It's unaffordable, and we have this rise of rent evictions that no responsible elected official, in my mind, can defend.
I see a last set. I'm getting a message saying, time to wrap, time to wrap, time to wrap. So I guess it's time to wrap. I'd love it if the audience could put their hands together for Mayor Olivia Chow. And for Parliamentary Secretary for Housing, Peter Fragiskatos. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that we'll continue this conversation.